the education funding in the state of Wisconsin has been increasing. I think almost every year there is more money allocated. People just say it's not enough. And, Tom and I have asked on occasion how much is enough, and we don't really get a descriptive answer there. But that discussion, while fine to be had, I guess, always takes the highlight. And I think right here in the local listening area, we have, again, sort of this very miniaturized version within the school district of Beloit of what we're about to talk about here, which is, well, is it all about how much money we're throwing at this, or is it about other things that go on in the day-to-day course of trying to teach a bunch of kids, and the regulations that have been heaped on and the restrictions that have been heaped on teachers in a lot of ways? And that's, I think, an important question. It was important enough, at least, that our next guest took a look at it and actually took the time to put together a documentary from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Associate Counsel Lauren Greuel is joining us on the Minuteman Press guest line. Good morning, Lauren.
Good morning, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. Good to see that some people are thinking outside of the box of the arguments that we're always presented with and saying, well, does this figure into that discussion somehow? And you took a look at what you're terming a behavior crisis in Wisconsin classrooms. Now, on and off, we have heard right here in our area from people within the school district of Beloit that is one of the big factors in getting that school system back on track. And parents are left with a little less confidence in that district and the disciplinary actions that either happen or don't happen. And that's why I think this is a great discussion for you to bring to us this morning, because obviously, while we might have a little microcosm of it here, it's not just one or two school districts that are experiencing these sort of behavioral issues.
Absolutely. This is a widespread problem. This is happening both across the state of Wisconsin and nationally. We, after putting this documentary out, actually have gained some traction abroad as well. There are teachers in the UK who are saying, no, this is a problem here too. And what we've been seeing is that this has been a largely ignored problem. There are teachers who feel very strongly that they are not being heard by their school districts or by their teachers' unions, if they're part of a teachers' union, and they are raising the red flag that this is a problem. You'll see in our documentary that we have some statistics in there that talk about how student behavior is really one of the number one reasons that teachers end up leaving the profession, leaving the classroom, and that's above pay. That's above some of these other common things that we hear teachers dealing with: workload, burnout. Student behavior just rises above a lot of those other factors. So it's high time that we start talking about it and trying to support teachers and bring the focus back to learning in the classroom.
The focus on the educators in the classroom, I appreciate, because I think, kids are kids. Kids act out to the degree they're allowed to in many cases. There's all kinds of stuff that would say, well, I don't know that this is about, the kids so much is what is the corrective measure that the adults in the room can take. And certainly we talk about that, in other instances with parenting and that kind of thing. But when and I know you interviewed a number of teachers, many of whom said, I'll talk to you, but only that if you leave me anonymous, because they're afraid of retribution. That says to me that there's sort of a little toxic employment relationship of teachers and the boards and or administrators running certain districts.
Yeah. And listen, when I say that student behavior is one of the things that are driving teachers to leave the profession, I don't necessarily mean that it's the student's fault.
Right.
To your point, there's administrative things that need to be happening in schools that are not happening, and teachers feel completely unsupported and on their own. They have students that are constantly disruptive in the classroom. Maybe it's not big things, maybe it's talking out of turn or things here and there, but it's constant, and it's constantly taking away from the lesson. And that in and of itself is a problem. And when those kids are sent to the office or referred for any type of discipline, what teachers are reporting is happening is that they're getting a treat or a snack, or they're getting a break. And these kids are learning that they're actually being rewarded for that behavior, and they should continue to do it again and again and again, because there's no actual consequences that they're being held to. And that's not an issue on the teachers, that's an issue with the administration. You hear some of our teachers talking about that. And it all kind of hinges on this theory that's been floating around in education since like the Obama era of like restorative justice, or, you know, improved quote unquote tactics for student discipline. And that's where a lot of this is happening. And then, as you brought up, there is a fear of retaliation for these teachers, because a lot of these administrations don't want to report how bad the problems really are, how often these things are happening. Teachers are discouraged from suspending or, you know, advocating for expulsion of students or other types of discipline, because it messes with the highline numbers, and schools don't want that out there. So there's a whole host of things going on here that I think a lot of teachers feel like they're not being listened to as they say are problems.
The relationship between teachers and administrators and the State Department of Public Instruction, if you look at it on paper, it looks pretty simple, and it's a typical hierarchy. But it seems to me that somewhere here they're losing that hierarchy at that bottom rung of the ladder. The teachers who should be able to go to the next rung up for support are not getting it, and I'm going to make an assumption here that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not getting it because the rung above the administrators that comes from the state is pushing down on them, saying, no, you can't discipline children for that. You can't tell them that they're wrong about that. You can't whatever. You're getting all this pressure from the state DPI that is filled with a bunch of bureaucrats and very few people that actually know what it's like in the classroom.
Right. Well, that's really why we wanted to talk to teachers and allow teachers to tell their own story here. You know, we can all sit in an ivory tower and think about what would make things better, but really the best way to solve this problem is to talk to teachers and see what they think would be the most helpful. And I think that that's a really good starting point for a lot of school districts. Talk to your teachers. How are they feeling? Include them in policy decisions as you're continuing to make them with regards to the teachers. There's some really great steps that schools can take to improve this environment. And I'll also just mention that the Republican legislature put up a bill this past session that attempted to address a lot of the issues that these teachers were talking about. That was 2025 AB 614 for anybody who wants to look at it. It passed the Assembly and then the Senate with bipartisan support and was vetoed by our so-called education governor at the end of March. And the primary citation for vetoing that bill was a lack of funding, like you were talking about right at the beginning of this segment.
Well, that's a good shield to hide behind, I guess. Well, we could fix this if you just give us more money. I think what you bring to light in your documentary, Lauren, is a little deeper than that. And I don't know. You could probably do 100 documentaries in sort of the related discussion points about this, because it seems to me I only recall, when I was in grade school, the fact that the paddle, so to speak, was still hanging on the wall. I do not believe it was ever used. at that point. We had advanced past that. But there were plenty of strict disciplinary rules when I was in school that some kids had no problem with, and other kids were a little more challenged to not squirm as much or not speak out as much. But by and large, they were tools that teachers possessed that were able to keep order in a classroom. And as time has gone on, I've certainly been a personal witness to watching one by one the tools that the teachers have in the toolbox be eliminated and replaced by sort of individualized care instructions. You now have these, I forget what the official name is of them, but basically if you got 20 kids in a classroom, 11 of them may have individual plans that somehow a teacher has to teach to. She has to, or he has to deal with medications, and, you got a document that says this child has this malady and this child is ADHD and this child, and they have to do all of this kind of stuff. And I can't imagine how you keep order in a classroom of 16, 18 kids with all of that going on and still get a lesson across.
Certainly, and that's something that's brought up a lot in this documentary that teachers are struggling with. I think as well, this is something that some of our teachers discuss, but there needs to be good expectations for students of cause and effect and consequences before they get out into the real world. And that's just something that we all, living in a civilized society, need to know about before we get out there. One of the teachers makes a comment that, the police department isn't going to care about an individualized plan, and sending them out into the world without understanding how their actions have consequences is actually doing them a huge disservice. It's not helping them. It's going to cause more problems down the line.
So, Lauren, I can already, I kind of always have a sense for what my listeners might be saying or thinking out there. And one of them is going to be, well, okay, but, I'm sure that she's just looking at the schools that have, stepped out and said they want to be part of this thing. How widespread is this? How many schools in Wisconsin can you extrapolate this information to say, this is how big the problem is, and how do you kind of, parse that so that it does apply to more than just a couple of circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually talked to dozens of teachers across the state. Only a few agreed to be on camera with their names. And I mentioned that in the documentary, and that speaks to a larger issue in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
We've kind of already touched on that. But there are dozens and dozens of teachers who we talk to who have major concerns about what's going on in education. Either they worked in public schools and then they left to go to a private school because the environment was so bad, or they're still in public school. There are a lot of teachers out there who are willing to talk to us and tell us their story, but because they're still working in these environments, don't want their name on it, which is, again, really sad. But we're talking about far more districts than just, MPS or the schools up in Fox Valley like Green Bay or Madison, some of these bigger districts. We're talking about, up northwest Wisconsin. We're talking about really small, close-knit rural communities where this lack of support for teachers has really permeated the school district and created additional problems. This is happening everywhere, not just some of these bigger districts where you might expect there to be more behavioral issues.
All right. The sort of the corollary rule here is you don't get to point out a problem without offering a solution. I'm curious as to what teachers' input might have been as to what could make this environment better, what could help to resolve some of this that we're now talking about. I need to take a quick commercial break here, Lauren, if you can hang with us, and we'll come right back, and I'll have you address that on your talk show on WCLO. Lauren Greuel is with us on the Minuteman Press guest line. She's an associate counsel at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty and has produced a documentary, Classrooms in Crisis, which we have been talking about, and some of the behavioral issues, and the fact that I guess I could sum it up best to say that there are many teachers that feel sort of powerless to be able to resolve these issues in their own classrooms under the current structures in which they operate. If that's a true assessment of the problem, the question becomes, what might those teachers have communicated to you in your discussions with them, Lauren, as far as what could help them out and help improve this situation?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple really reasonable solutions here that schools in our state can adopt at any time. You don't need to wait for legislation to do that. I feel like that's an important backdrop for the conversation. But a lot of teachers we spoke to say some of the most frustrating incidents occur when they remove a child from their classroom because of their behavior. It's unmanageable. The rest of the class is distracted, and the teacher can't teach the curriculum that they need to get through. And the child is immediately sent back to the classroom with a sucker or, some other snack. But they weren't held in the office. The behavior wasn't addressed at all. And in fact, the child was basically rewarded for the bad behavior. So something we heard pop up a decent amount was addressing underlying behavior, particularly as it pertains to persistently disruptive students or violent students, so students who are throwing things, hitting, kicking, biting, that kind of a thing. So if a child is persistently disruptive, so it's a constant problem, or they're violent, a good option for schools to consider is a behavior intervention plan to address underlying behavior before the child can be returned back to the classroom. So that's one thing. Another thing is prohibiting retaliation against teachers for removing students, enforcing rules, or reporting unsafe conditions or requesting help. A lot of teachers are very, very concerned about coming forward with the truth of what's happening in their classroom because they don't want to lose their jobs. So putting in place some safeguards for teachers against retaliation, especially and, exclusively when they're acting in good faith, right? If the teacher is doing everything right, they shouldn't be retaliated against by losing their job or losing privileges or not getting promotions or pay increases, right? And those are all things that they're really concerned about. Another thing that we heard a lot was that under Wisconsin law, parents of removed students have to be notified when their child is removed. That's Wisconsin Statute 120.13. But not every parent in the classroom knows that this is happening. And in fact, most don't. A lot of the behavior issues that teachers are reporting are coming from, a very small percentage of the student population in their classroom. So if parents knew of every time that class was disrupted or the class had to be evacuated because somebody started throwing things, I think there would be a much larger conversation about what's happening right now. I just think, and a lot of teachers express this as well, that a vast majority of parents don't realize how bad the actual problem is. So additional notifications to parents when this is happening can be really helpful. And then finally, adopting explicit board policies on reasonable safety measures for disruptive or violent incidents. Who do teachers call? Where do they go if they need to evacuate their classrooms? What do they do? Are things that need to be discussed ahead of time, not while they're happening.
Well, it seems like there are a lot of alternatives. I know this largely focused on, things in the classroom. At the administrative office level, Lauren, I just find from, all the reporting of incidents that happens across the state that I see, it seems to me that in there's some sort of unwillingness to get to a point where, for instance, the principal might call the parents every time, especially if they're afraid that the parents are going to take issue with the fact, and, well, my child would never act up, and it's the school's fault, and we're going to sue you, and I know that's probably a whole nother documentary at that level of interacting with the public, with the administrative offices. But it does seem to me that the administrative offices are it sounds like they're making a choice to be maybe more responsive to those outside forces and less responsive to the needs of the teachers in the classrooms in their buildings.
Right. And, I'm not going to pretend that parents' involvement in the classroom isn't something that came up. It certainly is. And we talk about this a lot. Parent involvement and willingness to work with teachers is very closely tied to better outcomes. So that's in general a good thing. But I'm sure there's also situations where the administration's kind of in a tough place. I don't want to discount that as well. But that being said, there's a lot of conversations that have been happening among teachers about, how well trained is everybody on how to handle student behavior, managing student behavior? What is being taught in universities in Wisconsin as people are getting these degrees and getting these licenses as it pertains to student behavior? And, you've said this a couple times, that could be a whole other documentary, So that's something that comes up a lot too. Like how do these people know how to handle student behavior? And maybe that's a whole nother avenue that we can look at or that's brought up in conversation because, I think there's something to be desired, left to be desired from the education or training that these administrators and sometimes teachers are getting when it comes to student behavior.
Well, again, I think all of these kinds of things, every journey into these issues begins with a first step. This is a great first step in identifying something other than we need more money factor. Most of this could be done without any money at all. It has to do with a change in the line of thought in a lot of cases. And just because you and I have been talking about it, I don't expect people to necessarily say, well, I absolutely believe them because they talked about it. But you talked to teachers. Teachers were at least in part willing to come on, or you have direct quotes from them. Where can people actually see your documentary and take a look at this for themselves? Yeah,
so Will has a dedicated webpage to it. It's will-law.org/safe-classrooms. And that's where you can see the documentary as well as all of our work on AB 614, which we talked about a little bit in the first segment, and some solutions for teachers or school boards to talk about in their own districts. Because again, even if there aren't legislative mandates requiring change, schools should be considering it regardless, especially if they're having teacher retention or quality teachers leaving their district or issues with that.
And Tim, it is posted on the podcast.
I notice it's right there linked. The YouTube version is linked on our description of the show here on the calendar and on the podcast. So we hope people take a look at it. It's a very important discussion point, I think, Lauren, and I appreciate the time and work you put in to putting it together.
Thank you so much.